Oh, we're feeling good. A good day today. Obviously, a lot of people out in the Capitol Square, a good chunk of people on either side of the debate, and the fact that things ended up peaceful. Obviously, our big concern was with that many people, tens of thousands of people on either side of the issue, you worry about it. But I've said all along that the protesters who oppose my bill have every right to be there, but I'm not going to let tens of thousands overload or overshadow the millions of people in our state, the taxpayers in this state, who want us to do the right thing to balance this budget. In Wisconsin, we've got a $3.6 billion budget deficit in this next biennial budget. That's a budget we inherited from the past. In fact, 2 years ago, a lot of the same Senate Democrats that have walked out of the state and are hiding out right now were the same people who gave us a budget that put us in a deficit. They used several $billion of one-time stimulus aid and used it to balance their Medicaid and school aid deficits. For us to be able to tackle that, just like nearly every other state in the country, you're talking about billions of dollars that's going to have to be cut from education, from the university system, from local governments. And what I've said throughout the campaign, and really fulfilling as a campaign promise, is I'd balance the budget without raising taxes, and I do it in a way that didn't cut core services. And the only way you can get at that is by empowering not only the state, but local governments to control their own budgets, to have really what's really a very bold political move, but a very modest request when it comes to paying for pensions and paying for health care. I mean, that's the great irony. For all the talk about an attack on workers in the state, what they're pushing, and what I saw when I was a local government official, was the collective bargaining law in the state handcuffed me. It prevented me from pushing alternatives to massive layoffs or furlough days or other things that really were quite devastating. What we've pointed out is we don't have the savings in this bill, particularly for the next biennial budget. We're talking about the equivalent of 5,000 to 6,000 state employees who have to be laid off, and a similar number of 5,000 to 6,000 local government employees. That's 10,000 to 12,000 people overall in this state who would be laid off if we failed to do that. That's unacceptable. We can't have anybody unemployed, be they in a private business or in the government. The last thing I want in the state, it's got a 7.5% unemployment rate. Granted, that's lower than the national average, but that's still unacceptable to me. I want to create an environment where we help the private sector create 250,000 new jobs, not put more people on unemployment rolls. We had tens of thousands of protesters all week. I mean, literally just outside the windows of my Capitol office. And you get the speakers and the chants and the whole bit, but I tell my staff I enjoy it when they put the soundtrack back on, because in many ways it's the soundtrack of my childhood. I think back to Journey and some of the other groups that they mentioned along the way. It gives us a little bit of inspiration, even though it's certainly not for our well-being. You got to look at it like that. President Reagan, whose birthday we just celebrated, 100th anniversary of his birthday a few weeks ago, was someone who, when I was younger, growing up in a small town in Delavan, Wisconsin, was a great inspiration for me. He knew who he was, he knew where he was headed, and he knew how he was going to get there. And to me, all the way along, for each of the offices I've held up until now, I've tried to pattern my political career after that. To be bold, to take on the status quo, and to let people know where you're headed and how you're going to get there. And I think back, what I love more than anything, and what I've tried to do, particularly in these tough, difficult decisions we have to make, is to ultimately be very clear and realistic about our challenges, but never afraid from being optimistic about our solutions. And in the end, these are bold moves, these are difficult times, but in the end, I know we're going to get better, because I know in this state and in this country, we have the will to take on the challenges and get the job done. Well, again, I've got good practice, having been a county executive in a county that never elected a Republican before. And in that county, I got elected not once, but I got elected 2 more times thereafter, because even in a county that went 2/3 for President Obama, I think people respect elected officials who tell the truth, tell people what they're going to do to tackle the challenges they face, and then they go out and do it. Here, certainly, I knew that this was going to be a bold political move, and anytime you're being bold, challenging the status quo, you're going to have people that lash out against it. But as long as we've been consistent, and all throughout the campaign, all throughout the transition, even in December when we tackled the employee contracts that they tried to ram through after the elections, but before I got into office, in anticipation of what I was going to do here. And since the inauguration, I've told people, here's our problem, here's our deficit. Here's what I'm going to do to solve it, and then I've gone out and taken action to do that. I think people respect that. Now, again, the thousands of protesters we've seen this week, well, they're ginned up by their union leadership. They've been told things that in many ways are half-truths or mistruths. But I'm accustomed to that. I've dealt with that at the county level before, and the voters have ultimately said, you know what? He's tough. He fights for me. He gets the job done. In the end, I want somebody who and we've been very respectful. We acknowledge that those tens of thousands of protesters have every right to be heard. But for 1 minute, I'm not going to let them overshadow the voices of the 5.5 million people who live and pay taxes in this state who certainly deserve to be heard as well. It's one of those where it's just ridiculous. I traveled the state earlier this week, and I went to manufacturing plants, mid-sized manufacturers all across Wisconsin. And what I found in each of those cases is good, decent, hardworking, typical middle-class workers, blue-collar workers out there who were just thankful that they had a job in this tough economy. Most of them were paying anywhere from 25 to 50% of their health care premiums. On top of that, few, if any, had a pension, and the few that had some sort of retirement, it was a 401k. And a number of those have had their employer, the businesses they work for, stopped the employer match over the last year or two because of the economy to try and just protect jobs out there. These are people who understand when they're paying 25%, we're asking for half of that. And they just don't get it. They say, where do I sign up for this? My own brother, typical middle-class family, my own brother is a catering manager and a part-time bartender at a hotel here in Wisconsin. His wife works for Sears. They got 2 beautiful daughters. They're an all-American kind of middle-class family out there. He told me last week, and he reiterated, he's paying almost $800 a month for his health care and the little that he's able to set aside for his 401k. He said to me, I would die. I'd love to have the kind of deal that you're putting on the table. Not what you have, but what you're asking people to pay for. I think in the end, set aside the corporations. I think the people who work in the private sector outside of government, they get it. The people of this state, the people of this country get it. And they understand that they've made sacrifices in order to protect jobs, to keep people working. And unfortunately, because of many of the unions in the state and across this country, they've told workers for years, government workers, they didn't have to sacrifice. They didn't have to give because they had the power of collective bargaining. We've got to change that so that we can balance our budgets and still protect jobs. Well, she, in the end, is like any good spouse, worries about me, worries about the things that we do, but in the end, appreciates that we're doing the right thing. For 8 years before this, I was the county executive in a county that had never elected a Republican before. And, I had difficult decisions. In fact, I remember early on, after I introduced my first budget, I came out, and the first parade I was in was a Veterans Day parade in November 2002. And instead of getting kind of the polite applause that politicians normally get, I had people standing up, cheering, thumbs up, way to go, you hang in there, you do the right thing. And after about 30 or 40 of those in a row, I'd get 1 or 2 people flipping me off. And then the same thing would happen over and over again. And by the end of the parade, my wife remembered every single person who had flipped me off. And I had to remind her that for every one, there was 40, 50 or more who were not just politely clapping, but standing up and cheering and saying, hang in there. Well, I think the same thing's true now. For my wife and a lot of other people who worry about my well-being here in this state, they worry when they see the protesters, but I remind them there's 5.5 million people in this state, and I think the overwhelming majority are saying, hang in there, do the right thing, do what we elected you to do. For me, I got my hands full balancing this budget and keeping it balanced for the next 4 years. So I'm focused on getting Wisconsin working again. We've got a great start in the first 6 weeks, but my eye's not going to move off of what I was elected to do, and that's to get people working again. One of the great myths, unfortunately for a lot of the protesters out there, is that somehow if we pass our budget repair bill dealing with collective bargaining, that all their rights as workers will go away. Couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, as each day passed and more national leaders from outside of our state came in, the lies and myths got bigger and bigger along the way. The reality is Wisconsin, at the turn of the last century, passed the most comprehensive, the strongest civil service protections in the country. For our state workers, they have the right outside of collective bargaining. So regardless of their contract, they have the right because of the civil service laws in the state to have merit hiring and just cause when it comes to discipline or even to the point of termination. Those provisions, those safeguards protecting worker rights continue. What many union officials and many certainly workers are unfortunately believing from those officials is that somehow the collective bargaining agreement helps. It doesn't. It is in place just as much for someone who's in a union as it is for someone not in a union. And that's something I think the more workers in the state understand it, the more they realize that really these national leaders coming in don't care so much about their rights as much as they care about the money. And the money they really want is the money that right now by law each of those workers are forced to pay to their local union, which ultimately streams up to the internationals in Washington and across the country. They want their hands on that money. It's not about protecting the workers or the workers' conditions to pay, because the unions have already essentially given in on that. They've said, well, we'll give you the pension and health care, just don't change collective bargaining and don't change the union dues provisions that automatically make them pay right now. For us, ultimately, we're going to end up cutting more than $1 billion when it comes to local aids for schools, for counties, for municipalities, and to enable them to make sure that those cuts don't push off towards massive layoffs or to impacting kids in the classroom. We're giving them the tools in this bill to ultimately balance their budgets. They don't have that right now. This isn't something I've concocted. Local government officials at the school boards and city councils and county boards have been asking for this for decades. This will give them the power and the authority to make prudent decisions about balancing their budget that don't lay people off and ultimately don't shut down curriculum in the classroom. Well, there's no doubt. It has multiple layers. And again, I saw it firsthand as a county official when I tried to do things like ask for a little bit more from pension or a little bit more from health care contributions, or at one point years past even tried to do a 35-hour work week as a way to avoid layoffs. The union leadership basically said, forget it. Go lay 500-600 people off. We don't care. I mean, that's where their mindset is. And so that's because they know the power of collective bargaining forces local governments not to be able to make those sorts of reasonable decisions to protect jobs. But it has a bigger impact as well. When you have people who are working for the government, who are forced to pay into the union, sometimes anywhere from $500-600 up to some teachers are paying almost $1,000 for union dues. When they're forced to be in that union, they're forced to have that taken out of their payroll. Those are things that ultimately take those dollars that we as taxpayers pay, and instead of compensating that teacher or that worker, we're ultimately paying a portion of that so that that union can come back and lobby for more government spending. It's a vicious cycle, and it's one where I think after this last election, people have realized, not only here in Wisconsin and across the country when it comes to states, but even at the federal level, we can't afford it anymore. We're broke. It is about time that somebody stands up and does something about it. And I think well beyond Republicans and conservatives, I think the average citizen in this state recognizes that. It's certainly, I think, one of the big reasons why they hired me to be the CEO of the state government. Well, for us, we're willing to take all the time in the world to get this done. We're not going to compromise on the principle of balancing our budget. I said we can't turn to higher taxes. That would cripple the economy. We've seen other states like Illinois to the south who did it a month ago, and it's already having a devastating impact on their economy. Employers are escaping to Wisconsin, realizing that Wisconsin truly is open for business. We're showing we're going to lower the tax burden on our employers. We're going to make it easier to do business in this state. So to balance our budget, we can't turn to the path that they've taken in the land of Lincoln. Instead, we've got to make sure we make the tough decisions. But I think people respect that. It's certainly what they elected me to do. There are multiple layers. We have ultimately have that sort of authority when it comes to state workers, when it comes to teachers and other local government officials. Those are dependent on their jurisdiction. That superintendents have already informed teachers in their given districts that if they fail to show up, that there's disciplinary action. Certainly we're going to support those superintendents who do that. In the end, though, what I keep reminding over and over again is even as the week began, we had 10,000-15,000 people. It built obviously through the weekend. But the reminder for the public is there are 300,000 plus state and local government employees, teachers, city workers, county workers, state workers. The vast majority of them showed up for work. They did what we paid them to do. They're good, decent public servants. This has never been about an attack on the people who've dedicated their life to public service and government. For us, this is about balancing a budget and saying that when the private sector is paying in many cases twice what we're talking about for health care, and certainly more if they have a pension, most don't, it's realistic that at a tough time when the private sector for years has been making sacrifices to keep people working, we should expect the same from government. It'll happen to me, it'll happen to my family, it'll happen to my cabinet and the people in the legislature. It should happen to all of us. Well, for us, again, it's about balancing the budget. It has been, will continue to be, and will always be about balancing the budget. But to the extent that we can show the rest of the country that we can lead when it comes to budgetary reform, to fiscal reform, to really tackling the tough issues. But I think in November, voters certainly here in Wisconsin, but I think across the country, elected people to turn things around, to balance the budgets, to stop the games. I said earlier this past week that we're broke, and it's about time somebody stood up and told the truth. Because for too many years, politicians have ignored that reality. They push the problem off into the future. We can't afford to go any further. We've got bill collectors ready in the coming months if we don't take critical action right now. And I think here in Wisconsin, and I think the stakes are similar all across the country. If we can show we can lead the way, we can balance the budget and still not lay off tens of thousands of people along the way, I think that's a great road. We've been a leader when it comes to welfare reform and education reform when Tommy Thompson was the governor. We want to be a leader when it comes to fiscal reform now.